Wednesday. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.
Okay, public comment. This is the time set aside for public comment. If anyone wishes to speak, please fill out a request to speak or call in. Ms. Sanchez, do we have any public comments?
No comments at the moment, Mayor.
All right, then I'm going to roll right into the study session. Item 4A, City Council study session for discussion on pension obligation bonds. Rob.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. This is going to be a full hour of discussion on pension obligation bonds. Before I get started, I want to introduce some of the team to you. I'm Rob Rockwell, the Assistant City Manager and the Finance Director. In the audience, we have Mary Beth Redding. She's from Bartell Associates Actuarial. And we have Jim Fabian. He's our Financial Advisor from Fieldman Rolap and Associates. And we have Diana Strong from Richard Watson and Gashawn. She's our bond counsel. So that's the team that it takes to issue bonds. I have a PowerPoint presentation. If we can get it to, okay. All right, now we're on a roll. So the topic is pension obligation bonds. And pension obligation bonds are a strategy to manage financial implications of promised pension benefits. The objective is, if you are not familiar with pension obligation bonds, is to hopefully you will gain that understanding by the end of our study session, and so that you'll understand the process. The ask is that the City Council at tonight's regular meeting authorize staff to move forward with the POBs and indenture purchase contract and then the validation process, which will get this POB ball rolling. The POB ball, if you will, we have to roll it for about 4 to 5 months for a conclusion. So there is a bit of a time issue. We want to make sure we get this process started as soon as we can. After tonight's meeting, it won't be the last time the council has a chance to discuss this item. Once we start the process and get through the validation process, which is the most time consuming piece, we'll still come back to you in March with the financing docs for approval before the POBs are actually issued. And that is the item that's on your agenda tonight, item 8A. So tonight, or this afternoon, we have 5 sections that we're going to cover. I'm going to go over some pension highlights, review of pension obligation bonds. We're going to talk about a financial analysis. We're going to go through a risk analysis, and then I'm going to go through the timetable, and that will be upon conclusion. So section 1. So the City of Indio contracts with CalPERS to manage its pension benefits. The agreement with CalPERS is dated 1957. We've actually been working with CalPERS for 64 years to manage our pension benefits. CalPERS manages 2 plans and 5 tiers. So we have a miscellaneous plan and a safety plan for those employees. Safety, 2 plans for miscellaneous members. And when I say plan, that basically means a change in the pension benefit formula. So classic members, you can see at the bottom of this slide, are 2.7 at 55, 2.7% of their pay per year at age 55 retirement age. And that's a classic. And then PEPRA, the Public Employees Pension Reform Act, was implemented in 2013 by law, and that changed all these formulas for miscellaneous and safety members. For miscellaneous, it became 2% at 62. And then for safety, it became 2.7 at 57. And the reason we have a third safety tier is that before the Pension Reform Act, the city initiated a new tier trying to get ahead of these pension benefits back in 2012, which was 3% at 55. So that's kind of the spread of the pension benefits. And go ahead, please.
Can you explain a little bit more the 2.7 at 55? What do you mean by that?
So the formula, it means that for every year that you work for a CalPERS agency, you get 2.7% of the average, it depends on the formula, but your highest grossing year at age 55. So if you worked 10 years, you'd get 2.7 or 27% at age 55. That's the way the formula works. You can actually retire at age 50, and if you do, that's the retirement eligibility age. The formula is reduced proportionally, but you can't get more than that. So if you retire, you could retire at age 60, but you don't get more than 2.7%. That help? So in the city of Indio, we have 967 employees that are eligible for pension benefits. We have 254 active employees that are currently working for the city of Indio, 136 employees that are employed that used to work at the city of Indio that are now employed at another CalPERS agency and have not effectively retired. And we're on the hook for the portion of time that they actually worked for the city of Indio. There are 106 which are referred to as terminated members. Those are members that qualified for the pension while they were working here, and now they're out in the world somewhere, maybe working for a private company, not working for a CalPERS agency, but they have not effectively taken advantage of their pension benefits. And there are 471 actual retirees that are taking retirement benefits at this time. So there's 967 members that are eligible for pension benefits from the city of Indio. So generally, the way this pension plan works is you have three sources that go in to pay the pension obligations. You have the employee contributions, you have the employer contributions, and then you have the investment returns that CalPERS makes investing those resources. And all of those are expected to pay for the benefits that are promised to the employees. But there are varying factors that makes this formula complicated, right? It doesn't always balance. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is that imbalance. There are economic changes that affect the market. There are demographic changes. People retire early. Sometimes the actuarials are changed. People's lifespans are assumed to be longer. And all of this changes the formula because you pay these benefits for life. So because of that, the inflows, if you will, has not balanced the outflows. So if you look at this slide, and if you focus in on the colored bars, and if you look, let's go look kind of back here in 1999. The light bars represent the liability, and that's the promised obligations, and the dark bars represent the assets, all the inflows from the employees, the employer, and the investment returns. And if you look back in 1999, 1998, those were relatively balanced. Well, actually, the assets in this case were a little bit more than the promised benefits. And if you look right above that in a line, you'll see that it says 128%. And what that effectively means is that we had more than 100% of the pension obligations in that pot, if you will, that was including employer, employee, and investment returns. We called it superfunded at the time, 128%. But that didn't last for very long. There was SB 400. AB 616, those changed the pension benefit formulas. The pensions became more lucrative, if you will. And then you had some recessionary impacts, the .com. You had CalPERS making some changes to the discount rate. And what happened is that if you look at 2004, you can see that the liability started to exceed the assets. And in fact, the pensions at that time were 87% funded. Also meaning that 13% of the promised benefits were unfunded, and that's referred to as the unfunded liability, the portion that we owe that we don't have in assets. Then you can see that right about the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, 2009, you can see that the funding went down to 60%, which meaning we have a situation where the promised benefits now is starting to really outweigh the amount of assets that we have in the system. And that 60% formula, while it's changed a little, we're still relatively at 60 or 70% funded over the last decade. So we really haven't gained any, go ahead.
Is this for the state or for?
This particular illustration
Yeah.
is for all of CalPERS. So this is
Okay.
a generalization of all the agencies that are in the CalPERS fund.
Okay, thank you.
And then it's averaged. So what's happening over the last decade is you can see that the liabilities are continue to grow, and the assets are not growing as quickly as the liabilities have. And so it's that unfunded liability piece, which is what we're addressing with pension obligation bonds, because we can clearly see that the market conditions are not going to fill this gap on their own. So this is specific to the city of Indio. So all those 960 members, all the promised benefits add up to $241 million. And there are $165.7 million of assets with CalPERS right now. So the gap for the city of Indio, and this is as of June 30th, 2022, but the actuarial information's 2 years old from CalPERS. So it's a little bit dated, is $75.3 million. That's the nut we're trying to crack right now. And so what CalPERS does is CalPERS bills us interest on that outstanding debt, in addition to charging us, billing us for the an unfunded amount on an annual basis, as well as normal costs. So this illustration here, if you look at the top portion of this bar, gives you an illustration of how much the unfunded liability has changed specific to the city of Indio. Go ahead, Roxanne.
I just wanted to note that Councilmember Amit is on the Zoom. Thank you.
Sure. I should have reached for my water when you did that. Okay, so this next slide is specific to the city of Indio. And the top portion is the unfunded actuarial liability. And you can see here over the last 2 years, it's increased about $4.5 million, about 6% is the increase. And that matters to us because we're asking that CalPERS is asking us as an agency to cover that gap on a regular basis. Now they average over a period, they don't bill us all at once, but still our costs are going up pretty quickly. And I'll show you a slide on that momentarily. Now the bottom portion of this slide is a combination of what we have to pay to CalPERS, the UAL and the normal cost. And you can see that we're paying in $8.6 million. Went up to $9 million in 21, and then it's expected to go up to $10 million this year. So you're seeing about a 20% increase. And it's important because one of the advantages of the pension obligation bonds is that we get settled into a known debt service payment that does not change. So some of these increases in costs that we're experiencing now will cease to happen for the city of Indio. In fact, what this slide illustrates is how much these costs have increased dating back to 07, 08. So what the council's probably heard on many a budget study session is we typically come and we say, there are the three main monsters, if you will, that are eating up our revenue gains are fire contract, insurance liability, and pension obligations. That's pretty typical how we always start our budget presentations. And you can see on average, the pensions have gone up about $500,000 a year. So when you're in our city and you normally see revenue growth of $1.5 to $2 million a year, $500,000 of it just going to pensions is a big chunk of what would be discretionary revenue for you to use to put towards other services in the city. This next slide is a projection looking forward. So what we have here is we have the normal cost and the UAL built in. It's not just the UAL portion here, but you can see that the majority of the increases are the UAL. And what's expected to happen for the city of Indio is you see these 10 million, you see a 10 to a $12 million increase over the next 2 years. That's a $2 million expected increase in our PERS cost over the next 2 years. And then you can see it levels out and then it potentially goes up to closer to $14 million. So we can expect over the next 6 or 8 years, millions of dollars of money that we're going to have to add to whatever we're already paying to CalPERS because of these liabilities. And then what CalPERS has built in here is that gradually these costs will come down, but that's not for another 15 years or longer, assuming they hit all the actuarial assumptions, meaning the rates employee salaries don't go up more than 3.5%. Market returns are as expected, in the 7% range. So this is subject to change, but the point is that our costs are going up. Now, what the pension obligation bonds do, as I just mentioned, they create a debt service obligation that'll mitigate much of these increases. So instead of having to worry about how much our new discretionary revenue is being eaten up by additional CalPERS costs, we just make a bond payment that's fixed for a period of time. Now, that doesn't mean costs for CalPERS won't go up at all. Certainly there'll be some fluctuations, but we shouldn't see the big impacts that we're seeing now. And the other big benefit from issuing the bonds is that CalPERS is billing us a 7% interest for that unfunded liability. And if we go to the market today, in 5 months from now, we're assuming we might be able to get an interest rate as low as 3.3%. If the interest rate environment gets worse, it could be 3.8%. But even at 3.8%, that interest rate is much lower than what we're paying to CalPERS on that outstanding debt, which is 7%. So a little technical information. Pension obligation bonds are a taxable form of debt issued by the government. This would typically our bonds are 30-year terms. This particular one would be a 22-year debt service obligation. The POBs are designed to take advantage of an arbitrage opportunity. What that means is that we're borrowing low, and CalPERS is expected to have a return on investment higher than that. The debt service payment replaces the UAL payments that we're making now. California's state constitution does not specifically authorize POBs, and what that really means is that the POBs are a little bit of a different process than it's not like issuing a regular bond or at least revenue bond. So the legal foundation to issue the bonds is based on state and the statute, because this is considered a refinance. The perspective is that we already owe this to CalPERS, so this is just refinancing that debt. And what we have to do to issue this debt is we have to go through a validation process, and that's what takes up so much time. The validation process, I have a couple slides on that, basically means we have to go to the court, prove that this is our obligation. The court has to bless it and ask if anybody opposes it. A validation process is exactly what we went through in 2016. If you were here when we issued the adjustment obligation bonds related to the Jefferson interchange, to issue those bonds, we had to go to the court and go through a validation process. So if you're familiar with it, then this is very similar to that. So the validation process does not obligate the city to issue the bonds. That goes back to what I said earlier. We're asking tonight for permission to initiate the process. We'll come back in March for permission to actually issue the bonds. The first steps in the validation process is the preparation of the bond documents, and we'll prepare those with maximum flexibility. And that's important because a lot of things can change between now and March. There could be various swings in the market. If the market goes too crazy and it costs us too much money to borrow, more than 4%, we're probably going to have to back off. There's also potential for CalPERS. They meet this month, and they're potentially talking about making some changes based on the investment returns that they had this most recent last year. So when we have you adopt the documents, they're going to build in a flexibility that's going to allow us to adjust. So it could be that we don't issue bonds for 75. We could issue for 60 or 65. The number is going to change based on what CalPERS tells us, and also based on some of our strategies, which I'll go through in a minute. So the validation action generally requires approximately 90 days from the date of filing. And again, we're kind of in a race. We're in a race because we don't believe the municipal interest rate environment is going to get any better. In fact, the scenarios that we're running assumes that the interest rates that we're going to have to pay as a city is going to be a little higher than what they are today. So we are in a little bit of an urgency to get to the market sooner rather than later, although we can't rush through the validation process. That's a pretty fixed process. So the validation process, why does it take 120 days, more or less? So after the city council adopts the recommendation authorizing judicial action, we have to file a validation with the Riverside Superior Court. They receive order. Receive order for application of summons from the court, which can take weeks. Publication of notice in the newspaper of general circulation has to occur. There's a waiting period for responding parties. Then if there's no responding parties that want to argue the situation for the city, the clerk enters a hearing for default judgment. Then there's a hearing for default judgment, there's a waiting period, and then finally, we can go forward with these bonds. Risks and disadvantages. So issuing POBs, there's a right way and a wrong time to issue a pension obligation bond. And even the Government Finance Officer Association at one time issued a warning about POBs because there are some cities that issued them at the wrong time and later it caused a lot of financial stress. So I wanted to walk through some of the possible risks of issuing POBs, pension obligation bonds. There's the investment risk, right? The investment risk that we borrow at 3.5%, hopefully better, and then we give it to CalPERS and CalPERS returns less than 3%, right? That would be a loss, right? But CalPERS, their 25-year average on the return is 6.9%. So we don't believe there's a whole lot of risk. If we were borrowing money at 5%, then I would say there would be higher risk that CalPERS wouldn't be able to produce enough returns to cover that cost of the city of Indio. So I would say as long as the interest rates stay in the low threes, we've really mitigated the chance of an investment risk. There's the overfunding risk. If we borrow $75 million and we give it to CalPERS and CalPERS has a couple more years of outstanding returns, we could be in a position of being, instead of being 70% funded, let's say we were 120% funded. Well, that's like somebody could argue, okay, you've taken good money and you put it into something that we didn't need to set it aside for where it's overfunded. The other disadvantage of overfunding is now under PEPRA, the law has suspended what's called pension holidays because they believe pension holidays is what got us into the problems to begin with. Back when we were super funded in the early 2000s, they allowed agencies not to have to pay into the PERS pool because they thought they had plenty of money to cover it. The time has told us that was not the right move. So the risk of overfunded today is that even if you are overfunded, CalPERS will continually still require you to pay into the pension fund. Our mitigation strategy is that we're not going to borrow 100%. We're going to suggest that we borrow 90% of the outstanding pension obligations, and then we're going to work with that 10% and see what the market does. Because rationally, you don't have to be, it's too much of a risk to be overfunded. You don't need to be 100% funded. If you're 90% funded, it's really a solid position to be in. And I don't want to mix pension obligations with retiree healthcare liability obligations, but we have a pretty significant retiree healthcare unfunded liability as well. So probably if we're 90% funded here, we have other liability obligations that the city should focus on. Credit risk. So when you go to the credit rating agencies, they're the ones that are going to tell the bondholders whether you are a good investment or a bad investment. So explaining our process to the credit rating agencies is critically important. And what the credit rating agencies are looking for is they want to make sure that you're not selling pension obligation bonds to solve a financial issue in your city. Because if you're trying to fix a problem, let's say you have a structural deficit, they're not going to give you a favorable credit rating. But if you are going to the market because you see the benefit of it, and you're going to take some of the savings that are going to be generated and you're going to put them aside maybe for other liabilities. Let's say you're borrowing at 90 and you're still putting money aside to get to 100, or you're putting them towards an unfunded liability for retiree healthcare, then they're going to see that this is a prudent financial move and they're going to give you a more favorable rating. So it's important for us that we don't just assume that all the savings is going to be backed and benefit the general fund or the city. We're going to have to earmark part of that for some greater financial strategies. The capacity risk. So a city, this issuance goes against our debt limit. We have a debt limit. We can't incur debt in excess of 15% of the assessed valuations of the property in this city. That's really not a concern here in the city of Indio. Our debt capacity is about $1.3 billion. So even at $75 million on top of what our only existing debt is our judgment obligation bonds, we're like at the 1% threshold now, and the POBs would put us probably at a 7 or 8% of our capacity. So capacity could be an issue in other agencies. It's not in the city of Indio. And then there's the deferred risk. And what that is talking about is that if we set the debt service payment at the same amount for 22 years, knowing that eventually CalPERS plan is the costs are going to come down after 15 years, we could be in a situation where we would be paying more on a bond than what we'd be paying to PERS in the out years. Let's say the 12th years to the 22. Is that right? So it's deferring your risk. It's taking savings today just to have to pay the debt at a later point in time. So our strategy is what's we're calling what's called a proportional payment schedule, and that means the payments will be flat for the first 12 years, and then for the next 8 years, they're going to be reduced, just like the pension obligation would have if we were not issuing bonds. So it lowers that risk of deferred. So we're not going to make the city pay tomorrow for our savings today. That's the bottom line. The last risk I want to mention that's not listed here is a timing risk. There always is the chance that we issue bonds, we give PERS our $60 or $75 million and throw it in the market, and then we have some bad market years, right? That's something we can't control. If you end up in a situation where you take big losses in the first couple of years where you've given PERS this large sum of money, it's really takes a long time to recover from those losses. It's like the opposite of compounding interest, right? We get CalPERS now, we have a couple of great years, we have this compounding interest. We're going to look like we were very smart in this action. We throw it in the market and we have some bad years and things don't go right. Well, then we're going to look like maybe we didn't make the smartest decision. That's a hard risk to mitigate. As you watch the stock market and make swings. So that's something that we're just going to have to understand, that the savings from this hopefully will offset any of those market strains that may occur over the short period of time. And I'm going to show you what the gains are from issuing a POB momentarily. Just quickly going over some of the strategies to mitigate the bonds. Issue less than 100%. As I mentioned, my hope is that we issue bonds that cover 90% of that outstanding obligation, not 100%. Consider issuing multiple POBs over multiple years. Well, that's okay if you're in an uncertain interest rate environment. We're in an environment where we don't expect the rates to be going down anytime soon. If we expected that rates could potentially go down, we're in a historically low interest rate environment. That's the bottom line. So it doesn't make sense for us at this time to partially issue the debt and then wait for the interest rates to potentially go down, and mitigate that impact. We think we're at the best position now that we're going to be. Mitigation of market credit risks. Basically what that's saying is that if, again, I talked about this previously, if we're borrowing at 6%, and CalPERS is expected to make on average 7%, that's a small margin. We believe we mitigated this because we're borrowing at 3.5%. And the expectation is that over the last 25 years, CalPERS has made 7%. Last year, they made 21%. That was an anomaly. But as you know, some years they also have losses. The pandemic was an unexpected timeframe where there were substantial losses. But if you look at the law of averages, a 3.5% or better versus a 7%, that puts the city in a good position. We have some swing there, right? Even if they have a bad year, we're probably going to have the better advantage. The last one is being prepared to issue POBs when the timing is right. That really has to do with the market and the interest rate the interest rate environment of what you're borrowing the money for, as well as the market conditions of when you're going to be investing it. We already told you the borrowing rate is low. That's to our advantage, and the investment market is, that's a little uncertain. Hopefully, it'll be steady for us for the next couple of years. This is a list of 51 cities that have issued pension obligation bonds in the last 3 years. So this isn't just Indio. You see Coachella's on the list, Corona, Huntington Beach, Ontario, and Riverside. So Riverside all have issued pension obligation bonds in the last year. So it's not just us sticking our necks out, thinking this strategy might work. All these cities believe that this strategy was the right strategy for them as well. And some of these cities, I think it was Newport Beach that I saw a few weeks ago, their unfunded liability is hundreds of millions of dollars. So in the grand scheme of things, Indio's $75 million really is not as significant as some of these unfunded liabilities in these other agencies. Okay, I'm going to hand the mic over to Jim Fabian just have a couple slides to go over the actual details on the bonds. It shouldn't be too painful. Jim?
Thank you, Rob. Once again, Jim Fabian, Fieldman Rollap and Associates, the city's municipal advisor. So we are definitely going through a lot of information, understand that. So if at any point you have any questions, just let me know. So on this slide, we just wanted to walk through some of the assumptions that we have on the bond that would be issued for the pension obligation bonds. As Rob mentioned, these are taxable bonds, so the investors do not have any tax advantages by purchasing these municipal bonds. Typically, the types of investors that purchase taxable bonds are more like foreign investors, for example, have bought a lot, hedge funds, insurance companies. So a different type of borrower or investor than you typically have for, like, for example, your public safety center that might be issued in the future. Additionally, the credit rating is based upon the city's general fund. The credit rating typically is very close to what you have, but in most cases, it's a notch better for a pension obligation bonds because S&P, who is typically the credit rating agency that is used, looks at the issuance of pension obligation bonds as a credit positive for the city overall, because you're trying to control a unfunded liability that you presently have. Additionally, we would recommend structuring them with a 10-year par call. So at year 10, you could pay it off at 100%. So that's an approach that has been used on most of those 51 cities that have issued POBs. They have a 10-year par call. Additionally, there's no reserve fund associated with the pension obligation bond. So there's no money sitting with a trustee that is invested for the benefit of the bondholders. There's no extension of the final maturity. As Rob mentioned, these are 22-year bonds. And you recall that slope of your unfunded liability, the pension obligation bonds would be structured to coincide with the payoff of that liability. What we tried to do is be as conservative as possible. Rob mentioned that we are in a rising interest rate environment. The Fed came out today and laid the groundwork for their tapering program where they're going to stop buying treasuries. That could be step one of seeing rates start to trend higher. We've tried to build in a cushion of 50 basis points and 100 basis points, so either a 0.5 or a 1% rate increase into our numbers to be as conservative as possible. Rob also mentioned our approach to the pension funding strategy. We are looking at that 90% level, not 100%. So you would avoid that overfunding situation that Rob mentioned, and you're currently at roughly a 70% level. So this is what it looks like at the 50 basis point cushion, or 0.5 or 1%, the 100 basis point cushion. So you can see there that, again, 2044 is the final maturity. That's the exact same length of the existing unfunded liability that you have with PERS. So the average life for these scenarios are 9 or 10 years. You can see there that, again, we're using the older data. So we're assuming about a $76 million issuance of bonds to pay off the unfunded liability. You can see the interest, the issuance costs are estimated at 1.2 million. That includes all the fixed costs associated with the consultants plus the underwriter's discount. We haven't talked about an underwriter, but there would be an underwriter added to the team, and they would be paid a fee for buying your bonds and reselling them to the investment market. The total debt service there you can see is roughly 98 million or 104 million, depending upon the higher interest rate. And we're looking at roughly about 6.2 million or 6.3 million as your maximum annual debt service. And then your average annual debt service is about 4.4 to 4.7 million. The interest rate, as I mentioned, would be about 3.3 to 3.8. And when you look at the gross savings, which is comparing your existing payment to PERS versus the proposed debt service on the bonds, it's roughly $23 million if we have rates that rise by 50 basis points, and it's about 18 million if we assume the 1% rise in interest rates, or the 3.83%. On a present value savings, when you look at factoring in the cost to borrow, it's roughly 17.6 million versus 13.5 million. So significant savings to the city by issuance of pension obligation bonds under the existing interest rate environment that we're operating in. This is what Rob was mentioning previously. You can see the difference between the red line and the blue bars is the savings. Obviously, with the 50 basis points, it's that delta is higher than it is on the bottom one where you have 100 basis points. And you can see that the red line mimics your existing payments. So you have debt service that trends lower at the end of the liability. If you're going to take it back over. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So I just wanted, touching mouse. So just to reiterate that in a good interest rate environment, we're borrowing at 3.3% more or less. We'll have almost $24 million in gross savings. And if the rate environment isn't so good, gets closer to 3.8, we're still going to have about $18 million in savings of what we'd have to pay to CalPERS. So outside of the risks, if things work out the way we think they will, it will be significant savings to the city of Indio. An average savings about $1.2 million a year. And so if you think about the fact that half of that we might want to obligate towards another financing strategy, maybe retiree healthcare, but it's at least $500,000 or more in real savings to the city of Indio. So because there are many possible outcomes, we hired Bartel and Associates, who are actuarials, to run 1,000 possible outcomes for you. So I'd like to invite Mary Beth to come up and tell you what happened in those 1,000 scenarios.
Thank you, Rob. And actually, we ran 4,000 scenarios altogether, but we are not going to go through each of those 4,000 scenarios. So I'm Mary Beth Redding. I work for Bartel Associates. We are a firm of actuaries, and our expertise is in working with agencies who are part of CalPERS. So this is a lot of what we do. So I'm going to talk about exactly what we did and hope mostly to give you a feel that we've really analyzed the risks involved and given staff, city staff, the information they need to help, work with you to come up with a good decision about what to do. So the way we evaluate as a POB is we look at the future cash flows. So we say, if you did nothing, if you did not issue a POB, how much would the city owe in the future to CalPERS? They're going to bill you payments every year. Your costs are going to grow as you hire more people and they age, and just sort of looking at that into the future with no POB. And then we say, okay, we know that. What if you did issue a POB? Well, you would be obligated to make your debt service payments. You would take the POB proceeds, you would give them to CalPERS. CalPERS now has more money to invest, and they would reduce the amount they bill you every year in your future contributions. So we look at the difference between those two things and say, did it come out good or not? And obviously we can't tell you for sure, because CalPERS, what they charge you is going to depend a lot on the investment return they get every year. And we can't tell you for sure what that's going to be. Okay, so that's where we look at our 1,000 different scenarios for what that investment return was. And for each of them, we say, was it a good deal or not? And just to make the calculations well, we're actuaries, so we think they're better if we do a present value. And what we mean by that is if you can save $10 today, that's better than if you save $10. So we give more value to the things that happen sooner rather than later. Okay. So most of the 1,000 scenarios we do, it comes out better for the city. And the reason is, as Rob said, CalPERS is charging you 7% interest on the debt, on the unfunded liability, and the debt service you pay is going to be a lot less than 7%. But there's really two kinds of scenarios where things don't go so well for the city. And the first is when CalPERS investment return is very bad. If you think back down to 2008 and 9, they were at minus 24%, followed by a minus 5% return. So, it's not always good. It gets better afterwards, but those particular years can be problematic. The other issue where it doesn't come out the best for the city is actually if CalPERS has very good returns. Again, as Rob said, you're required to keep on paying the normal cost, but when you look at those scenarios, your costs to CalPERS are exactly the same whether or not you had a POB. But if you did issue a POB, you have the debt service on top of it. So there's really two ways things can go badly. Investment return is really bad or it's really good. But most of the times in the middle, it comes out fine. So when as we said, we model 1,000 different sort of random scenarios. They're not totally random. They're meant to simulate the returns that CalPERS is likely to get. We do that by looking at how they're invested and what the statistics are for those investments. So I always sort of picture them as rolling the dice to see what the return is going to be in every year, but it's not really a fair dice. It's a loaded dice. It's going to most likely come up with what the return CalPERS is likely to get, but some years you get a really good number, or a really bad number. Okay. So we went through the 1,000 scenarios that are mixtures of good and bad and average return years. For each one of them, we say, did the city's cash flow come out better with the POB than without it? And I'm going to give you a little amusing picture to help you envision the charts we produce. So let's say I do my first scenario. It's got 30 years of sort of semi-random economic fluctuation. I find out that if the city issued the POB, it was $100 worse than if they had not. So I have my little helper guys, and I give this first person a sign that says minus 100 because we're $100 worse. And then I do my second scenario. This one came out good. So plus 150, that person gets $150 sign. The next time I did it, I was $300 ahead, $500 ahead. Then I got a bad one. I lost $200, and then I was $15 ahead. And I do this so 1,000 times. So I have 1,000 different scenarios with 1,000 different results. So what I do is I take those 1,000 scenarios and I put them all in order. So again, I envision now I've got my little helper people, except 1,000 of them standing in order from worst to best. Then I ask them, people who got a really good answer, put your sign way up high in the air, and people who got a bad answer, put it down low. So we get this little graph, right? That's what this chart is. Except instead of 5 little people, I've got 1,000 trials there. Each one of the height of the bar, up or down, is the result of that particular trial. And so what is this telling us? This is telling us something about the risk. This particular scenario, these 1,000 trials were if the POB equaled the full amount of the unfunded liability, and we know we're not going to aim at that, so it'll come out a little better. It's the most likely borrowing rate, we think, at 3.27%, and we think that the CalPERS discount rate will go to 6.8%, but again, we're not sure until their board meeting. So there's a lot of iffiness here, but it might be sort of the most likely scenario. So when I line up the bad results and the good results, you can see the tail on the left is very low. It's showing you that there is a small number of trials where the results really didn't come out very good. If you look at where it crosses between red and green, that's the 29th percentile. So 29% of the trials came out badly, 71% came out good, and those are green. And then you'll see as you move along the green side, you get better and better results until there, some sort of impossibly good results off on the far right. I don't want to say impossibly good, but unlikely to happen. So what we always look on this is where did it cross zero? 29%. So most of the time, well over 50% of the time, we're getting a good result. If we look right in the middle at the 50th percentile, it's actually a $10 million savings present value. If we look like 75th and 25th percentile, because a lot of people think that's sort of where it's likely to be in that middle 50th percent, you're kind of looking at results between, if it's bad, losing $8 million or coming, I shouldn't say losing, having an $8 million more cash flow, but on the good side, you're about at $25 million reduce of cash flow, all present values. So it's really saying this is very likely to be a very good deal for the city. And again, it's not our final numbers. We've done 4 sets of these already for the city, and we'll be doing more as we find out what CalPERS has got in mind. So in summary, what we're calculating and giving to city staff for their analysis is how likely is it that cash flows in the future are going to come down? And the answer is very likely. How much are the savings likely to be? And then we're also providing information about if cash flows don't come down, how likely what is the sort of order of magnitude of increase in cash flows that you're looking at? And it's very nice to be able to see that in the bad scenarios, the losses are much less than we would expect in the good scenarios. Okay. We produce a summary chart like this for the city that shows kind of that same information, except a lot of numbers. So I'm not going to walk you through it all, but for each set of trials, we look at what are the averages of the good scenarios, what are the averages of the bad scenarios, what are all the different percentiles, and we produce charts so that the city can compare the different sets of modeling. Okay. So far, I said we've done 4,000 trials because we've looked at 2 different possible CalPERS asset allocations. Again, we don't know what they're doing. And along with that, 2 different discount rates and then 2 different borrowing rates. And likely we're doing more. We'll do these were all sort of a worst case borrowing the full amount of the unfunded liability. We'll be looking at borrowing 90% as well as building in CalPERS' changes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Beth. I'm just going to go over the timetable, and then I'm going to open the floor up for questions. We've already gone out for an RFP for an underwriter, so we'll be choosing a banker here in the near future. Today, of course, we're giving you this information, hoping that you allow the staff to move forward at tonight's meeting. If approved, we'll go through a judicial validation process that will start in November and probably end in February and January. I hope to come back to you and present you with the unfunded liability policy, and that will be the policy that obligates the city to set aside some of these savings for these things that will give us a better credit rating. We'll meet with the credit rating agencies in February. We'll come back to the city council in March with the actual financing documents for issuing and the disclosure agreement for the pension obligation bonds. We'll have to wait our 30-day period, and then hopefully by the end of March, beginning of April, we'll be able to sell these bonds on the market. So that's the plan, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Lots of information to absorb. Team, any questions at this point? Please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Rob, for bringing this forward, City Manager. I've been looking at trying to push this forward for a while, now. So I think it's a great opportunity for us to help shore up our pension obligation at a lower rate. I think it makes good sense to me to be able to save the kind of money I think we can. I think it makes good sense for us. But you said if we overdo it and we still have to pay the amount, how do you, when you're talking about that, don't they give us like a credit on it? Or, I mean, how does that, I mean, we're in the black, they're charging 7%. They got ours. We don't get to charge them 7%.
If we're overfunded, it's time to petition the state for a change in the law.
Okay.
And when there's enough cities that are overfunded, I'm sure we'll have the wherewithal to push those changes in the law.
So it actually
There's
has to be-
just so many, nobody's quite there yet, I
so it
guess
did
is
have
the
to be
point.
changed in the law actually
Yes, sir.
technically to be able to do it.
Yes, sir.
But I think it still makes sense when, obligations, the city of Indio is 90 years old. A lot of this debt has came through, exactly like you said, we were funded at a good rate there. CalPERS has not met their obligation to us and the thing, the rate that they're going to. And I think if we can get this at the extremely low rates that we are, pay this off, I think it'll help us. And anytime you can save, you're talking millions, you're not talking dollars, you're talking millions. We can use that for other stuff. How does Measure E play into this too? Will that help our credit rating, even though it's a separate, it still goes in the general fund technically, even though we use it for one-time projects, it still is a source. Will that help us to get a better rating as we go for the bonds?
It will, knowing that revenue source is now, doesn't have a defined end date, that will certainly help us. Not maybe some degree on the pension obligation bonds, but certainly on other debt issuances when we want to go to the market and borrow money for other infrastructure projects.
I appreciate it. Thank you for all your hard work.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. First of all, I appreciate this presentation. It's something that, I support as well. I just have a couple of questions. Can you go over the roles of our consultants and what we actually do during this process, from the advisor to actuarial and the underwriter? Like, during this process, what are the actual duties of those folks?
Okay, so our financial advisor, you're asking for what the duties are.
Yes.
So a financial advisor, they're really the experts in the market, right? And what we can expect when we go to the underwriters, where the bankers are the ones that are going to buy our bonds and they're going to sell them in the open market. And the financial advisor is going to keep an eye on the underwriters to make sure we're getting the best values that we can when the bonds are sold. Diana from Richard Washington Kashan, she's going to make sure that all of our bond documents are up to par with the law, and we have all the disclosure requirements. Because when you're selling bonds on the market, there are SEC requirements. You have to make sure the information that they're basing their investments on are all accurate and above board. So Diana's is our legal eyes and all the documentation and the process. Mary Beth's role is I think is pretty much done. She's done the 4,000 lifts already. We're going to take her information, and if we need to do more analysis, then we can get back to her. But I think her role is mostly finished. And those are basically the players.
And we have a RFP for underwriters still, right?
Yeah, that is out on the streets. And I believe we have responses to those RFPs. So it's just a matter of, we've asked Philman Roll-App to actually analyze those RFPs. We've asked them to give us pricing not only on this issuance, but potentially other issuances in the next year, assuming we perhaps go to the market for money to build our public safety campus. So we're trying to increase the economies of scale by looking at and we also want an underwriter. An underwriter not only has to sell your bonds, but they have to have the capacity to potentially buy bonds from you that aren't immediately sold on the market, because you're trying to hit investment rate spreads, and some of them might appeal to the investors and some might not. So you really want to pick an underwriter that has the capacity to to pull you out of any unfortunate situations, because you don't want to end up in a situation where not all your bonds sell.
And just for a refresher, say we're going for 90%, and then we have that 10%. Can you go over just that 10% one more time?
So the 10% just means that we will be 90% funded. Right now we're about 70. And that 10% will just be a floater. If there's a good CalPERS year, maybe the assets might grow and it might be 91, 92, 93% funded, or it might, bad returns, it might fall to 89, 88, 87. We just believe that the fluctuations around 90% is better than the fluctuations that may be 100 or higher.
And then say goes over.
That's right.
All right. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, I think go right ahead, Councilmember Ortiz.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what was the process in choosing U.S. Bank National Association as the trustee for this?
So the trustee, their role in the process is, once the indenture documents are approved, they kind of make sure that everybody follows the rules. So they're really looking out for the bondholders to make sure that the city's making their payments. When you have when you have a reserve, sometimes you have to issue bonds, you have to put money aside that covers a payment in case a city doesn't make it. And in that case, the trustee would hold that money for you. There's no reserve fund in this case. So in this case, the trustee is just going to be a pass through. The bond proceeds that come from the investors are going to pass through the trustee, and then they're going to come to the city, and then they're going to be, or they're going to be passed to CalPERS in this case. So the trustee in this case really has a limited role. When you're issuing other bonds, like if we're issuing bonds for construction, then sometimes if there's a little bit of bond proceeds left over, they might hold on to them, and then they might invest them on your behalf while they're holding on to them. But that's not the case with the pension obligation bonds. Does that answer your question, Councilmember Ortiz?
Yeah, but and then so when we're paying the interest now with the new bonds, who is benefiting from those interest rates?
The bondholders.
Bondholders. Okay.
That's right.
And those are the ones that the underwriters are going to go out and find.
Yeah, and sometimes there are agencies, that are selling these bonds, but it's individual investors mainly. They're buying those bonds and they're gaining from the interest rates.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
And they fluctuate over the spectrum. Like a 2-year bond might have a different rate of return than a 10-year bond. The other thing I wanted to mention is that typically our trustees are the same company that we do our banking with. So typically that would be Union Bank, because Union Bank does our checking account is with Union Bank, but Union Bank recently portion of the business. And it was purchased by US Bank. So they basically inherited the trustee process for the city of Indio.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Councilmember Amit, any comments or questions?
I have none today. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Well, this is certainly, I think, a very advantageous move on our part. I wish we could have done this a few years ago. I think we would have been even further ahead, but I really appreciate your bringing this and making sure that we are focused on this. It's very, very important to us, and it certainly is something I support. So thank you. Yes, go right ahead.
I just have one final comment, Rob. If you could just reiterate, the reason why we're doing this is to save the city this large amount of money because of interest rates. I want to make sure that the public understands that's the goal. It's a lot of moving around and a quick, verbiage going around, but to make sure that we're doing this for a great reason to save us funding so we could put it somewhere else as well.
I think the simplest way to look at this is basically we're refinancing a mortgage, right? CalPERS is charging us 7%. We have the opportunity to refinance that mortgage at 3.5%. And if that was your home, you wouldn't hesitate to take advantage of that interest rate environment. And I don't think the city of Indio should take advantage of that interest rate environment as well.
Thank you.
Okay. No further questions? Thank you very, very much. And perfect timing. Gosh, did you rehearse it like this? Perfect timing. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 4:00 and, okay, we're still good. And this is the closed session of the city council. May I have roll call, please?
Yes, Mayor, for the record, all council members are present today.
Great, thank you very much. And item number 2, public comment. This is the time set aside for public comment for items not on the agenda. Public comments may be provided in the manner prescribed on the first page of this agenda, which is to say to fill out a form or call in. Do we have any public comments?
No comments, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Item number 3, I will defer to our city attorney.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. The City Council will adjourn into closed session for consideration of the items that are listed on the agenda, items A through H. Thank you.
Thank you very much.